Welcome to episode 1 of studies I've been reading lately that I think are interesting. Let's go. So, in 2014 and 2018, the Pew Research Center conducted studies on 2,000 Americans each, asking them whether or not they thought the internet was a net positive to society. But the interesting bit isn't the percentage of people who thought the internet was a net positive. It's the reasons they gave for thinking the internet was a net positive. You see, the most common reason for thinking the internet was a net positive was it brings people closer together and helps people connect with their family a lot more. However, the most common reason people gave for disliking the internet was, are you ready for this? The exact opposite. They said that it brings people apart and isolates us. Now, as always, people seem to think they're more responsible than the rest of society, clearly. The other interesting thing was that 70% of people think the internet is a net positive, okay? Update, I found another study for you from July of 2020. I want you to, so based on the fact that in 2018, 70% of people said the internet was a net positive, okay? From the exact same country, in the exact same demographic, what percent of people 2 years later thought the internet was a net positive? According to this study, and it's perfectly possible they just, picked a different group of people or whatever, 10%. 10%. To be clear, this was during COVID, right? When the internet was allowing you to work from home, okay? If the internet didn't exist, people wouldn't have been able to go to work, or maybe they would have been able to go to work, but they would have just gotten COVID and millions more people would have died. The internet also allowed you to access the updates on COVID without having to actually go and talk to people and therefore spread COVID, and it would have saved lives. So you would think that the internet would have increased in popularity during the pandemic, but apparently not. The main reason they cited for disliking the internet was because it spread disinformation, and while that is true, the internet also allows you to fact check that information. Like before the internet, for example, okay, it was impossible to fact check it. If 2 or 3 of the newspapers that you read that day all got it wrong, okay, or gave different accounts of what happened, you would have never ever been able to fact check it because that's just impossible. But with the internet, you can fact check any piece of information you like within a matter of minutes. Disinformation has existed for thousands of years. The internet just makes it possible to fact-check said information. Another couple of studies that I was researching that I found interesting were studies on the effects of climate protest on public opinion, okay? In 2019, an anonymous donor gave an anonymous donation to Extinction Rebellion, telling them to use the money to perform protests to see if their protests worked to swing public opinion in their favour. So they did a survey of a few hundred people before, during and after their 2019 mass wave of climate protests, okay? Yeah, for those of you that don't know, in 2019, Extinction Rebellion just pretty much stormed London almost. They did loads of climate protests in the British capital city. They did the survey and found that the effect was not that much. Okay, you can make your own opinion about exactly how much of a difference is enough to make a statistically significant difference, but in my opinion, that is a negligible difference, especially considering that the study was only done on a few hundred people. So I guess the Extinction Rebellion protests don't have that much of an effect on public opinion. In fact, at the very beginning of 2023, Extinction Rebellion announced that they were going to start making just peaceful protests and only peaceful protests, not the disruptive protests that they used to do. A few months later, tens of thousands of climate protesters surrounded the Houses of Parliament. Another survey about climate protests was one they did in America. Some of them read a story about a peaceful protest, some of them read a story about a violent protest, and some of them read a story about a civilly disruptive protest. That was the kind of thing that Extinction Rebellion used to do. And some of them didn't read anything. They also made sure to categorise whether or not they were Republicans, Democrats, or Independents. After they'd finished reading the stories, or not reading the stories in the case of the control group, they were asked exactly how much support they had for the protesters' aims. Overall, the Democrats had the most, followed by the Republicans and the Independents. The people who read something about a peaceful protest had the most support for the protesters, followed by the people who read something about a civil disobedience protest, followed by people who read something about a violent protest, followed by the control group. So, according to the results of this study, any protest does in fact increase support for your movement, however a peaceful one works best. However, this did vary by party. The Democrats didn't really care if you were being peaceful or civilly disobedient. Independents followed the average trend, peaceful, civil disobedient, violent and control. But the Republicans, while still favouring the peaceful protests, put violent ones in second place, civil disobedient ones in third place, and the control group still ended up being fourth.